Test. All right. So he came up with this awesome title. It was good. It was sweet. But after our talk, I kind of threw up this meme, and I honestly this is I think is a better title for the talk, and that's Core's vulnerabilities are worse than cross-site request forgery. So how many folks have heard of cross-site request forgery? Good. All right. Over half. Awesome. So I want you to leave here thinking the next time you do some development or an app test or whatever it is you do on a day-to-day basis, I want you to think about how Core's vulnerabilities are amping up what we see in CSurf, because most folks across the industry think CSurf is pretty much dead. You know, we've eliminated it with our content types. We've eliminated it with our frameworks, with our double submit cookies, so on and so forth. Same site cookies, right? Well, that's not the case with cores. That's not the case with cores vulnerabilities. So I'm getting a little ahead of the content here, but keep that in mind. So yeah, we're going to go over web apps in 2019 and why cores is important. We'll talk about the same origin policy and what that means in regard to cores and the internet in whole. I'll go into what cores is, right? Is anyone here just kind of ramping up on what cores is in general? Don't be shy. Everyone knows everything. Okay, good, awesome, awesome. Hopefully, at least a couple people will get something out of this talk. We'll talk about some security concerns with cores, and if you haven't seen it yet, when Tim and I developed this talk, Tim actually developed an exploitation framework for cores vulnerabilities, which is really neat. It's already released. It's out on GitHub. I'll give you the link if you want to play around with it. But I'll show you a little bit of a demo or record a demo with that, and then we'll wrap it up. So a little bit about me. I'm at Cody on Twitter. I tweet, I'd say a fair amount. I'm from Pittsburgh. Anyone here from Pittsburgh? Pittsburgh. Awesome. I happen to work for an autonomous vehicle company. So if you see any of our cars on the road, we are in DC. So if one cuts you off or you cut it off, feel free to tweet at me and I'll yell at them, or I'll send you video of you cutting us off, because that's probably what happened. Actually, fun story, and I have a picture of it if you see me afterwards. But one of our cars was out on the road here in one of the DC suburbs last week, and they actually caught an eagle just come down the middle of the residential street, come down, grab something and take off. And so we have, in all of our vehicles, we have two drivers. We have the person who's behind the wheel ready to take over at any moment. And then we have someone who we call the right seat driver, and they're there on their laptops at all times. We may get to the point of removing the right seat driver at some point in time. The left seat driver is probably going to stay for a bit while we're ironing things out, right? But at this point in time, we have two drivers. Well, the right seat driver decided to stretch their legs. They got out. They were literally stretching, and the eagle just flies right past them. And so our cars have a series of cameras on the roof. So you literally see a 360-degree view. So if you watch the video back, you see the person get out, they're stretching, they hear the noise, they look up and just see this eagle, just huge eagle, just fly right down the middle of the street and take off. Then you see the driver get out and look over at the safety driver like, what? And then you get, you see the whole perspective. So anyway, we took some still frames of that. See me afterwards, I'll show you. But it came down, and I kid you not, it got a rat like this big. I mean, the eagle was giant. The rat, I thought it was a small dog. I mean, it was huge. So anyway, I work for autonomous vehicle company. I get to hack on and around autonomous vehicles, which is fun. I'm a vulnerability stumble uponer. If you talk to some people I work with, which there are a few in the audience here, they'll tell you I fall ass first in this stuff. Like, I just open things up, I find vulnerabilities, and I move on. I am not a prolific hacker in the sense of like a Tavis Ormandy type, where I'm going to mathematically prove out how XYZ works and why it doesn't work. And I just open things up and things fall out, and I say, hey, I don't think this is how this thing should work. And then I do that the next week. So I happen to be the chapter leader of OWASP Pittsburgh. So if you happen to be in Pittsburgh, come out to one of my meetings, and I would love to see you there. And this is what I do in my spare time: husband, dad, hacker, lockpicker, fisherman, and I try to fix stuff off of YouTube. So without further ado, what are we seeing in 2019, right? So things have changed quite extensively from, early, even 2010s to now, as far as what our application makeup is. So today, what are we seeing? We're seeing a lot of single page applications, right? JavaScript, very client side heavy. Sometimes we have apps that are just client side only. And I'm not talking about serverless, right? There are people who are, oh, he's talking about server. No, I'm not talking about serverless. I'm talking about entire clients that are built in JavaScript and never have a server component. So they're processing media, or they're doing something on a client browser somewhere, or Electron somewhere, and they never even have any online component, right? It's all client side. In addition, in 2019, we're seeing a ton of asynchronous communications. So Bayou, Comet D, long polling, and of course, WebSockets, right? So you think about those things, right? Really heavy JavaScript apps, asynchronous communications. Well, what comes with that, of course, are microservices. And with microservices comes this bevy of sub or super domain. So when I say super domain, I just mean what's before the TLD, right? So if it's kcody.co, I'm talking about kcody. When I say subdomains, I'm of course talking about api.kcody.co, case may be. No, hold on. Got to get the sound for this to be good. All right, one more time. So this is Cassidy Williams, Cassie Do on Twitter. If you don't follow her, please, anything else you take out of this, just start following her on Twitter. She's awesome. She makes a ton of these like little Vine or TikTok-esque type videos, but they're all about developing. They're really awesome. How many folks have done development and you're looking at your dev tools and you see that little red CORS error, right? Raise your hand. All right. Yeah. So you know this, you know the feeling, right? And this probably was your first introduction to CORS, right? It's just this stupid thing that gets in the way of us getting our jobs done, right? Well, with CORS comes this larger overarching thing, which is the same origin policy. So if you're not familiar, the same origin policy boils down to a security control that make sure that when you're talking to any type of website or endpoint on the web, that you need to talk to the same protocol, host, and port. So what that means, right? So say we have http api.owasp.org on, of course, 80 because it's HTTP. So if you look at that and you say, okay, so we have HTTPS api.owasp.org. Is that on the same origin? No, no, because it's a different port, HTTPS. We'll say 443. Okay, so now we have HTTP just superdomain OWASP.org. Is that the same origin? Not as confident, but the people who did no is the correct answer, right? So it's a super domain. So even though api.owasp is on that same domain, it's just a subdomain. If you're talking on API dot and you want to reach out to the super domain, that is not kosher with the same origin policy. All right, what about HTTP API OWASP.org 8080? No, of course, that's a different port, right? So the same origin policy, again, it is the really the traffic cop of the internet as we know it today. And it's enforced by the browser. So that's an interesting control, right? Because we're used to our security controls being enforced by the server side controls. We always say, do everything on the server side. Enforce it on the server side. Don't trust the client side. Well, this is actually a control that's only enforced on the client side. It's a browser security control. So let me ask you a question. If you are testing same origin policy controls in, say, curl or Postman, or Burp, can you test for same origin policy? No. So I should say Postman, depending on your settings, you may, because it's Electron based, blah, 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 blah. But like curl or burp, no. So that's another interesting thing. When you're testing for cores, how many people test in burp or zap or something regularly? Okay, yeah, right. Well, you can't really test for same origin policy in burp because that's a browser control. So there's been many times where I'm like, wait, this can't be right. Well, it's not right. Same origin policy, but that's done at the browser. So pretty interesting. Um, Same origin policy restricts the impact of cross-site scripting. Well, when you think about cross-site scripting, it's literally defined as a script that is embedded and reaching out to another origin or doing something that you don't want it to do. Well, if we didn't have a same origin policy, the entire internet would be cross-site scripting, right? Any JavaScript anywhere, XHR, anything would be able to interact with anything else, right? So the same origin policy is really, really crucial. So I mentioned Tavis Ormandy earlier. If you don't know him, he's kind of like the prolific Project Zero guy for Google. A lot of what he's found are actually sandbox escapes or just like same origin policies turned off in different projects that fork Chromium. So if you're interested in the same origin policy and like how bad it is if the same origin policy doesn't work, look at some of Tavis's work. It's really, really interesting. One thing to note when it comes to same origin policy, of course, same origin policy doesn't have any impact on cross-site request forgery. All right, so when we look at same origin policy, I usually walk around a little bit. I'm trying to stay close to the mic, so excuse my lack of motions here. But when we look at the same origin policy, this is kind of what we're looking at. So on the left is the browser. This is where the user sits. In the middle is the app. This is your server. And then over on the right is a third party. So if your user reaches out to your app to do GET requests, pulls down all the static content, HTML, JavaScript, CSS, etc. If there's some script that's embedded in your site that's reaching out to a third party, that is a cross origin. So again, different port, different sub or super domain, different protocol. If that request goes out to a third party, that data should be restricted coming back. Now, that sounds weird because that happens a lot in what we do. And that's because of CORS. Now, I should say that this is, actually, I'm going to go into CORS a lot further here, but just note, if you embed, say, jQuery or some type of script in your application that is cross origin or cross site, that can work as long as you're not trying to push or update information or pull information in an authenticated manner. So CORS is a server controlled, remember that, server controlled mechanism to bypass the same origin policy. Same origin policy is the default cross origin behavior, which I'll talk about more in a moment. Does anyone remember server-side mashups, or does that ring a bell to anyone? Yeah, okay. So we have at least one. So server-side mashups were kind of this idea where you would go out on the server and pull down a bunch of resources and do basically server-side request forgery, but in a controlled manner, and pull all these things together and then push that out to the client. So the burden was on the server at that point in time. The server was doing all the processing. The server was doing all of this mashups. Well, CORS basically pushes that ability down to the client, so the client can then reach out and pull that data down. It allows client-side apps to call cross-origin APIs, XHR requests, right? And there's two types of CORS requests. So this is really important. There's simple and there's pre-flighted. So let's talk about that. This is a simple cross-origin request. User reaches out to the app pushes down the static content. User's browser then reaches out to a different app, a different subdomain, microservice, etc., and that information is then pulled back down with access control AllowOrigin and the data. So this only works for a small subset of requests. I don't really outline this here, but these are things that are basically non-state changing. And it's like simple GET requests. There's actually, if you're interested in the mechanics of CORS, I highly recommend that you go out to Mozilla and look at Mozilla's CORS guidance. It breaks all this down into really, really good detail. But simple cross-origin requests are interesting because basically if it's a simple GET request and it only has certain content types, basically it cuts out a step of having to pre-flight the request, which pre-flighting is this. Basically, same first step, right? User reaches out to your server, pulls down your bundle. Then the browser says, hey, third party, our user wants to do this thing. You know, they want to do a put, they want to do delete, etc. And you know, what is this? Is this allowed? Right? Same origin policy restricts this. So that's done with the options request, or I'm sorry, the options HTTP method. And so the options is sent out to the third party. The third party responds back with some headers. And in that headers, one of them includes the access control allow origin. Once that's returned, the user's browser says, yes, that's okay based on the same origin policy and CORS, and then it reaches back out to that third party, does some type of state changing HTTP method or includes credentials or something, and that data is pulled back down. So if this is still a little fuzzy, I promise we're going to get into a lot more detail. But when we talk about CORS, we of course have some CORS concerns. We have we're going to go over basically a problem statement, which is where we're going to get into the weeds. We'll talk about the same origin roadblock, some CORS solutions, maybe, Wildcard Origin, and Arbitrary reflected origin. So let's dive down. All right. So when you look here, it's important to note that we are doing we're forming a request from OWASP.org, right? So if you're going to an OWASP meeting, you go out to OWASP.org, Nova chapter, whatnot. And then from there, there's some JavaScript XHR request that wants to send a post request to meetup.com with the event RSVP path with JSON that says presenter equals Kevin Cody, right? So this is basically me subscribing to meetup.com from OWASP.org saying, hey, I want to attend this event and I'm going to be the presenter. So this is what the browser does. Because I'm doing a state changing request with post, JSON content type, etc., it does a pre-flight request. And this is what that pre-flight request looks like. Basically, it says, hey, Kevin's coming from origin, OWASP.org. He's going to the host, meetup.com. The host is where the options request is sent to, and says, hey, on the event RSVP path, what's Kevin allowed to do cross-origin? And the server comes back and says, hey, Kevin, he can do post or options requests. These are the content types I accept, et cetera, et cetera. So nothing works. But wait, I got a 200, got the allow, right? Why didn't that work? Well, this was actually a post. Yep. No, you're good. You're good. So the reason we got the CORS error is because of the same origin. All right, so this is the default condition. Same origin policy is in place, right? If we don't properly introduce CORS, and which you'll see here more in a moment what that means, things break. Things break. We don't get any money. We don't get any money. The business shuts down, right? What just happened is default. And this is most likely what causes insecure configurations, right? So when we're developing and we get this red error message, like, oh, crap, CORS again. How do I get beyond CORS? Why isn't this working, right? So the dev makes some changes. It's important to note the next several options requests are all going to look exactly the same. So coming from OWASP.org to meetup.com, event RSVP. All right. But this time the server says 200, okay. great, but there's a new header, access control allow origin with an asterisk. Nothing else changes. This time, it works. Well, it kind of works. If I was meetup.com and I was letting people subscribe to events, what would I most likely want to have? Some type of authenticated state, right? Right now, there's no authentication on this endpoint. So this works from an unauthenticated state, but this resource actually does require authentication. So the developer goes in and they make some more changes. This time we get 200 OK, access control allow origin asterisk, access control allow credentials true. What happens now? Are we good? Are we bad? So great point. So access control allow credentials is actually what tells the browser that it can include cookies from your cookie jar. So great point. And just to confirm, everyone heard, he was saying that basically there's no headers, there's no credentials in that request. But this is actually before that request goes out. This is the pre-flight, and the pre-flight says, hey, you can send credentials. So that's actually good. But there's another trick here, because let me tell you, this doesn't work. And the trick is, well, nothing. Sorry, I got ahead of myself a little bit there. CORS error. It doesn't work. So wildcard origin. If you have a wildcard origin and access control allow credentials equals true, the browsers have deemed that so dangerous with that combination. Because basically what that means, right? Any domain from anywhere can now access your cookie jar and get credentials from that site. So because of that, the browsers have actually said, no, we're not going to allow that. That's way too dangerous. So that's really weird, right? We already have this kind of weird kludge where same origin policy is a client-side controlled security control. And CORS, although it comes from the server, it's really up to the client to control it. Well, now we have this client enforced, actually not even client enforced, browser specific enforced security control that says asterisk and true, no go. So it's CORS is really strange. It's kind of an anti-pattern from what we're all used to from web, previous to CORS. But because the browsers have done this, this is now the new normal. When you go out and you download a CORS framework or library, it almost always will default to an asterisk. Because what does that mean? It works out of the box, but it doesn't expose you to basically credential theft, right? So it's considered safe. It doesn't allow unauthenticated requests or unsafe requests that change the state, right? But what was our problem statement? We needed authentication, right? So the developer makes some more changes. Same request. Options from OWASP to meetup, RSVP. And this time we get access control, allow origin, OWASP.org, right? Great. Access control, allow credentials, true. We're cooking with gas, right? We're working well. And it works. It works with authentication. Mission accomplished. Move on to my next task, close that sprint, right? We're good. Well, we thought we were good, but some security jerk comes by and does this, and they get this. So let's look back here. Host, meetup.com, same host target, but origin is some random origin.com. And what do they get back? Some random origin.com in the access control allow origin. Does anyone know what this is? Yeah, basically this is the kludge for the asterisk problem. This is called arbitrary origin reflection. Anything you give it, it's going to echo back to you, right? So now this is exactly what you said. This is probably the worst CORS misconfiguration you can make. Give it anything, it echoes anything back. What have you done? You turned off the same origin policy. Any script running on that page now has full access to your cookie jar. Bad news. And I got ahead of myself again. But anyway, arbitrary reflected origin, cookie-based credentials can be included, so it's super bad, right? This is actually really common. The Go RS cores library is vulnerable or was vulnerable to arbitrary origin reflection. Rat cores in Ruby was vulnerable to arbitrary origin reflection. Flask cores from Python is vulnerable today from arbitrary origin reflection. And Go cheat cores in Go is vulnerable today for arbitrary origin reflection. So if you have one of these, the two bottoms especially, go out and take a look. Our buddy Evan Johnson, he actually, and I'm getting ahead of myself. Yeah, here on the bottom there. Evan Johnson did some research. Really good guy. He works for Cloudflare now, but he did a bunch of basically did a scan. And I think it was the Alexa top 700,000. I don't know why it was 700. I don't know if that was just the list he pulled down or he was trying to get to a point and then he just stopped. But whatever it was, he scanned the Alexa top 700K. If you look at the gist on the bottom there, that actually includes the output of that scan. This was back in 2016. It was bad, but my guess is it's only gotten worse because, as any of you who work in any shop know, everything's migrating to microservices. The more microservices have to talk, the more cores we need, the more cores we need, the more shims we put in our code to bypass these sort of things. So my guess is if you take that gist and you do that same scan that he did and bounce those numbers, we've only gone up. But I'll let you do that. But if you're interested in arbitrary reflected origin, definitely take a look at Evan Johnson's info. And on his blog, he breaks down like what his methodology was, where he figured out this arbitrary origin was a bad thing, etc. All right, so I teased this at the beginning. What's the difference between cross-site request forgery and Core's arbitrary reflected origin? Right, so let's break down what CSRF is again. CSRF is basically where you send someone a link or you embed a link. That link makes a state-changing event in the user's behalf, in the user's browser. And because they're authenticated or they have a cookie in their cookie jar for that site, it basically tailgates into that site on that authenticated session. So that's bad. But it sounds a lot like what I just described, right? You have this arbitrary reflected origin, it tailgates in on your cookie. So they sound a lot. What's worse about cores over CSRF? Anyone have any idea? All right, I'll just get to the good stuff. The attacker can actually see the response to that query or that state changing thing. So if you send someone a CSRF attack, that's blind. They just wait. Maybe they try in a couple hours to access with your changed password that they forged, or they wait to see their money pop up from your bank account to their bank account or whatnot. But with cores, the whole idea of cores is cross origin. So if someone does something on your behalf, they can funnel your response back to them because it was their script that did it, right? That doesn't happen in CSRF. So how can we mitigate arbitrary reflected origin attacks? Because this is a very, very big concern. Well, we can use origin whitelisting. The problem with origin whitelisting is you can't just give your cores library a big comma delimited list of all of the origins and have that reflected back when the preflight request comes back, right? So that's what we'd like to see. We'd like to see options for RSVP and the access control allow origin come back and say, hey, these are the origins that I allow to talk to me. Because it has to come back. If you don't put anything back in that response, the browser doesn't know what is or isn't allowed. So that has to come back. You can't just like gatekeep that from the outside. One problem with having a big comma delimited list, if that was allowed, would be info disclosure, right? Now you tell an attacker, you tell a bad guy all the different sites that you allow this to take place. So I can see why that might not be a great idea, but what do we have to do in response? We basically had to build that logic in on the server side to check the origin, and it can get kind of hairy. But that is the best way to do it. If you can whitelist an origin, awesome. You can avoid cookie-based auth. So I think you mentioned headers. Headers actually aren't vulnerable to this because headers are stored in local storage or session storage on the client side. But headers have their own problems, their own difficulties. So I wouldn't say abandoning cookie-based auth is the best way to avoid this, but it's a way, I guess. If you're interested in like why headers aren't necessarily a bulletproof answer to cookie-based issues, I highly recommend you look up a talk by Randall Deegs from Okta. It's called JWT Suck. Now, it's a little negative, but his points about why JWT may not be the answer that everyone thinks it is are really on target. They're really good. So I highly recommend you take a look at his talk. So again, I put a big asterisk next to cookie-based auth avoidance because that's, in my opinion, that's not the answer here. Please. So that's the problem. So the question was, just in case someone didn't hear, if you had a big like comma delimited list, how does the browser interpret that? Does it send it back? The problem is you can't actually send the comma delimited list back to the client because the browser doesn't know what to do. That's not what the RFC states. So to do that type of whitelisting, you actually have to process that on the server side, either in the library, hopefully it supports that, or you have to build a shim into the library to validate your list of allowed origins. I wish it did. I wish the browser could just take a big list of origins, parse that out, and say, go, because that would make it a lot easier to do whitelisted origins. Again, a little bit of info disclosure there that you may not want, but for the most part, I think it would be better than where we are now. But yeah, so let's talk about wildcard origins. So wildcard origins won't let the access control allow credentials true work because that's just so dangerous. The browsers have said, no, we're not going to allow that. So are there any issues with wildcard origin? Right? You can't really hijack in on someone's session because the browsers XNA'd that. Wildcard look dangerous, but they're not really dangerous, are they? Well, I thought of that question, believe it or not, it was 18 months ago. And I actually called up Abdullah as one of the people when I thought of this edge case. And basically, I'll cut to the chase. We can send unauthenticated requests. So we can't do the Cerf thing, but we can send unauthenticated requests from any user to a vulnerable service via XHR or AJAX, and we can access the results. So unauthenticated, vulnerable services, access results. What does that mean? Well, I thought about that and I just thought, like, okay, if I can abuse someone to go somewhere and the only restriction is I can't use authenticated requests, there has to be something bad that I can do via unauthenticated requests. So I created a small POC. Again, this is when I called Abdullah. I'm like, dude, does this make sense? Because I can't be the first person. I'm not Tavis Vulnerability. I'm not finding 0 days out there. I'm definitely the vulnerability stumble upon or right. So I called Abdullah, like, this can't be a thing, right? Like, I can't be the first person who's thought of this. I thought I was crazy. I called up my buddy Tim Tomes. Has anyone heard of Recon NG? Okay, a couple people. So Tim, guy, a few of us have worked with in the past. He developed Recon NG. He loves to write code. I'm not a big coder. So I called up Tim, explained the problem same way I did to Abdullah. Tim thought I was crazy. I told him to sleep on it for 24 hours. I called him the next day. He gave me a big list of reasons why I was wrong. We resettled on it. We realized that his list, while not incorrect, didn't cover this edge case. So Tim created a better POC than what I did. And it turned into the core's exploitation framework. So again, Tim's always looking for a reason to write code, so he whipped this up for me. It's purely a proof of concept. This is not going to be something like Recon NG or one of the other awesome frameworks out there for pen testing that's going to be supported till the end of time. This is one and done. I'm going to show you the demo. You can go out there and play with it. There's no real good reason to use this thing other than for the badness I'm about to show you. So again, that's one of the reasons why we're like, we're not going to really keep this thing going. But basically the idea is it uses a distributed attack surface via a C2 command and control like infrastructure to do a distributed attack. And you can define that attack, but a distributed attack. And the reason this works is because of this permissive CORS policy, the asterisk in the origin. You could easily do this with cross-site scripting. So if you found a cross-site scripting on, say, a brochureware page or an unauthenticated page somewhere, this could be easily done. Or you could embed it in, say, an advertisement somewhere, or if you like squatted on an NPM project somewhere, you can embed it in there. And if you ever use the browser exploitation framework, Beef, this is a module that's just waiting to be written. But again, we don't really want to write it because there's no real good that can come out of this. But you can easily also use it for internal network mapping and so without further ado, let me show you this demo. Can you see that? Okay, yeah. All right, so let me give you the lay of the land here. On the left, basically, we're just starting up a hook. Don't worry about that. It's just starting up a page. That's just a web server. On the right, I'm sorry, let me take a step back. On the left, we're just starting up the tool. On the right, we're just starting up a web server. Okay, so it pulls up the browser. The user goes to our web server. This web server is the tool itself. This is the CORS Exploitation Framework. So you can see here, nothing's going on right now. So what's happening now is we're adding an attack. So right now we're saying, okay, well, we want to use the post method to our juice shop instance. We're going to put in what the user name and password parameters look like using Python expressions. We're putting in what the content type header is. And now we're looking for what is going to come back in the response that indicates a successful login and what comes back when a failed login happens. And then we queued up an attack. Now we're choosing a target and we're loading up a list of credentials. So what I've kind of held off by telling you so far is what we're about to do is perform a distributed online password attack using one victim, which is a site that, say, has a cross-site scripting, or I'm sorry, we're using one victim, excuse me, that is our target of the online password attack. So this is your online banking site. This is your company's site that has a username and password field. And then we're targeting another victim that happens to go to a page that has a cross-site scripting vulnerability in it, or happens to go to a watering hole attack, or happens to go to a place that has our embedded JavaScript in the site. So we're aiming one victim to another victim. And if you can think, if we can get one victim to go to that, we can actually queue up a bunch of victims to go towards that same site and make it a distributed online password attack. So right now, we're just loading up some credentials. This is the cred pairs that are going to be used for the online attack. All right, so on the left, we're going to the vulnerable site that has a cross-site scripting in. On the right, we're doing the same thing, but we're just showing you that it's incognito mode. No creds, no funny business happening here, right? And if you look, see this 401 unauthorized? That is an attack. Basically, what happened was this number is going to go lower and lower and lower. This victim is basically sending authentication requests to 25, 13 over here. That number is just going to keep going up, up, up. We're basically taking one victim, saying, here's a bunch of credentials, try to log into this. see it's quick. Really, really tiny payloads. We're talking bytes. If you were doing this in the background, you can see that number. This is only 2 victims. And every time that refreshes, every couple seconds, we're going down another 10. This is actually throttled really, really high. It's only 1 payload a second, just so that you could see this, because when we didn't throttle it, we ran out of payloads like this. Super, super fast. What you see here is a valid credential, right? Password equals admin123, email equals admin@juiceshop. This is a successful attack. And this is where it comes back down to that thing I told you, where Core's vulnerabilities are more dangerous than CSRF because you can get the response back from the user. It's not blind. So we're using that to leverage the ability to send credential pairs to a vulnerable or to a target site. And once that works, syncing that back up and knowing what credential actually worked, depending on what header came back. Was it a 200? Was it a 401, etc. Right? Brute force. But what makes this more dangerous than a typical brute force? Well, that's good. But the bigger thing is you can't stop it. It's distributed. So if you were defending against this, you're on the blue team, right? You're seeing, oh no, we have an online password spraying or online brute force attack. What do? Maybe you throttle. Maybe you ban that IP. Well, this is a valid user. This is a valid IP. You just rotate that IP. Another victim comes. They start hitting your site. Another victim comes. So two dangerous things here. One, you start blocking real users. Two, as soon as you block one user, another one's going to come out, or there's going to be a ton of simultaneous attacks going on, right? So again, this is why we created this demo. We wanted to show the problem. There's not really a good use case other than abuse for this scenario. So this is why we released the code. We didn't want to do like cloak and dagger, like, oh, look at this thing, okay, but you don't want to see the man behind the curtain. So we published it, but in all reality, this is just to show like kind of the dangers of cores, but there's not really a good use for the Ceph tool. So that's why we're not really maintaining it. Yep. Oh. Yep. So what you see here on the left, the white screen, on the right, the dark screen, this would be like your typical user going to a site that has malicious JavaScript, or going to your site or someone else's site that has cross-site scripting or a watering hole attack of some sort. And they are then subscribed to an event which is controlled by the attacker that's saying, hey, go to this site that we've now aimed you at and try this credential pair and give us the result. Now this one and give us the result, and this one. So the attack isn't coming from the attacker. It's being funneled through another victim. So if the attackee, the website, bans the IP, they're actually banning the IP of another victim. So, yeah. Yeah, please. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there's basically 3 components. There is a victim who is landed on a website or cross-site scripting or JavaScript somewhere. There's the command and control server, which tells the victim where to go and what to do. And then there is the victim 2, which is actually the site that you're aiming victim 1 at. Because you're using this command and control infrastructure to point one victim at another victim, both are kind of being victimized. But at the end of the day, if the second victim starts blocking these attacks coming in, they're just blocking other victims, right?
Similar type of the stuff is coming on my site.
You can definitely look at refer as an indicator of compromise. However, depending on the port and depending on the method, refers don't always come through. So if you can differ the port from like HTTP to HTTPS, the refer doesn't always come through. So there are tricks that you can play with refer, but that's a good one. That is a very good point. The other thing is, because it's C2, you may have victims hooked. You could always stand up another site that hooks them, or another cross-site scripting, or another payload, right? So yep. A refer is absolutely an indicator of compromise if the attacker doesn't do something to avoid the refer coming through. Very good point. All right. Yeah, so the script, let me show you here. Try one more time. This script, thank you for participating in our distributed attack against. This script is actually being hosted on the attacker's site or the attacker's JavaScript or whatnot, right? This is the hooking script that then sends the victim to the other victim. Because this is controlled by the attacker, they can then see the response to their XHR request that's sending you or the victim somewhere else. That's how CORS works. CORS says, hey, you're starting here, you're going cross-origin to somewhere else, you're abusing that somewhere else's site that has the asterisk as the cross-origin HTTP header response. You're abusing that asterisk, and because of that, the way that that response comes back is to the original site that sent it, right? And then to that original site sends it back to the user. That's how CORS works. So because CORS is meant to go from one origin to another, back to that original origin, back to the user, the original origin, in this case this, can see the response. So it's not directly coming to the browser, it's going to the web server of the website. It comes back to the. Well, you can, yeah, you can set like, so in this circumstance, and I'll send you the link to the code, you can set things up like a, what is it, the event stream. We used event streams to basically abuse that so that we could subscribe to that event stream and see those responses coming back. So CORS requests don't always necessarily have to come back to the site that sent them, but because we're hosting that that JavaScript, we can abuse basically a Java event stream and subscribe to that and see those responses coming back. All right, so the reason I brought that up again is, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yep. Mm-hmm. That's what actually what his question was. Basically, oh no, it's a good question. So basically, we have a Java event stream that we're subscribing the user to that we can see. This is what we're sending you to. Get back that response, and we're basically matching that up whether that was successful or unsuccessful. So we know what we're sending them to. So like what credential we're asking them to log in, and we know whether it's a successful response based on that event stream that they're subscribed to. So it may make a little bit more sense when I send you the code. And if you look at it and you have more questions, definitely hit me up. Yeah. You're right. Yep. To the original user. Absolutely right. Yep. Yeah. So it could be just an attacker's website that hosts the hook. It could be cross-site scripting that hosts that hook. It could be an advertisement. It could be a watering hole attack. Basically, anything that hosts JavaScript could be abused in the way to then, because basically these are AJAX or XHR requests that you're making towards the other site. It can be, basically any JavaScript that is malicious. So what we're doing is we're taking advantage again of that asterisk. And the reason we're taking advantage of the asterisk is because all of these frameworks are set to say, hey, you can't send authenticated requests with that asterisk. So the asterisk is the new normal. It lets cores work, but it's not as dangerous because you can't send authenticated requests. So all of these libraries usually will default to either reflected origin, which is really bad, or most commonly the asterisk. So there are some mitigations that you can use to prevent this attack. You can use a synchronized token pattern the same way you would to mitigate cross-site request forgery, right? So if you have a nonce, you send that to a user, the user sends that along with their authentication credentials. You validate that on the server side. This attack doesn't work, right? What I can say is the majority of authentication calls, like what we have used here, don't have synchronizer tokens on them because you have to know a secret to authenticate. So usually just knowing the secret is enough to stop cross-site request forgery. So if you can think of it, if an attacker wants to cross-site request forgery a login, they set up HTML or XHR, whatever the case may be, and it says, hey, log into this site. Well, they're going to have to include the username and they're going to have to include the credentials. But the whole point is they're trying to log in via CSRF. They wouldn't know the credentials. So just some type of secret is usually enough to prevent cross-site request forgery. So that in and of itself historically has been a reason why enterprises don't put synchronizer token patterns on authentication calls because it's a secret. You can't CSRF someone in with a secret that they don't know, right? It's kind of chicken versus egg. So, and even if they do have a synchronizer token on an authentication call, my history from what the apps I've tested, they're rarely enforced on the authentication page. So some final thoughts. I'm sorry. The other thing is whitelisting the origin, right? If you don't send back the asterisk, again, you actually do the work of whitelisting what origins are allowed to do cross-origin request sharing. That also mitigates this, right? So if my site is now making cross-origin calls to your site responds back with, these are the origins that I'm allowed to talk to. It doesn't respond back. It checks on the server side. These are the origins I'm allowed to talk to. My attacker site's not in that origin. That call never works. So some final thoughts. There are bad recommendations on CORS everywhere. CORS is confusing. If you look at Stack Overflow, if you look at an example I'm about to show you here, a lot of them will tell you to use the asterisk. A lot of them will tell you to use a library. Please. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so sorry guys. So you go, user goes to abc.com. abc.com sends back HTML, JavaScript, CSS for anything, and then the user then goes, they see the website, all that kind of stuff, and then they go to log in. They send that login request back to your site. In this HTML or maybe the JavaScript, there's a nonce. There's a one-time code that's returned when the user requests the site the first time. That code is then sent along with their credentials, username and password, back to the server, and the server validates that that code is genuine. the lifetime of the session. It can be down to every request. Basically, that's where they receive that code. And from an attacker's perspective, the server is validating a unique code. The attacker's not going to be able to do it. This is actually built into a lot of frameworks. Basically, you name the programming language out there. There's some anti-CSRF role that uses some type of nonce, usually a GUID or some session like value. But that's how anti-CSRF synchronize your code. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. So, but how do you mitigate force using this synchronized token?
If you have a synchronizer token on your login, what I just did wouldn't have worked because the attacker wouldn't know the synchronizer token to send with the brute force attack. So basically, protect your resources that you're concerned about brute forcing with a synchronizer token, especially unauthenticated resources that you're worried to, like maybe signing up for email lists or group signups or something that's unauthenticated, because we're abusing that asterisk thing, right? We can't use credentials or pre-auth. If you use a synchronizer token on top of that, then you're basically saying that someone without knowledge of that synchronizer token would not be able to brute force. So basically, my recommendation there is to use what's already being used to mitigate CSRF to also mitigate this CORS vulnerability with the Wildcard Origin. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, I can show you if. And the reason I bring that up is because, again, it's already being done on a lot of sites. The biggest problem is it's usually done post authentication, because again, the secret of just the password was enough to mitigate cross-site request forgery. So it wasn't implemented, that control wasn't implemented on login pages. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, a CAPTCHA would absolutely be, if you had reCAPTCHA or some type of CAPTCHA. Again, not usually enforced on log. Well, actually, no, it's I'd say pretty frequent on login pages. Yeah, absolutely. CAPTCHA would work. Yeah, absolutely. So his response was, if you have some type of smart CAPTCHA system that's seeing a bunch of requests coming in from a single IP, the throttling would kick in. I would definitely consider CAPTCHA as part of that throttling protection. Yeah, if you all of a sudden started throwing up CAPTCHA, that attack would absolutely stop in its place. Since it's distributed, you probably have another one that would come in right after that, but it would absolutely, yeah. All right, so again, vulnerable CORS implementations are everywhere. Sometimes I've actually seen this a lot. I've tested applications where I'm like, why is this site even using CORS at all? This is weird. Why, what's going on here? And believe it or not, self-document, who here has used Swagger or has Swagger? Okay. Swagger recommends or sometimes requires you to use CORS just to use their self-documenting API feature, because a lot of times it's hosted on a different port. And if it's hosted on a different port, it needs CORS to be turned on. So next time you have an app and you're like, why is this using CORS? We don't even need to check. It might actually be because something like Swagger is turned on a different port, and that's actually creating the problem. I've seen that more than one time where I'm like, yeah, I have stories. Also, enable-cors.org literally recommends using all these different libraries that default to either Wildcard or Reflected Origin. Again, your default state of solutions, if you have a library that defaults to bad defaults, you're going to end up with that in the wild. And that's basically what we're seeing here. Some default to Wildcard, some default to Arbitrary Origin reflection. What I just showed you was just a unique attack against the Wildcard Origin thing, because that's considered the new safe. In reality, although it's a thing, it's something I just showed you that could be abused, really the Arbitrary Reflected Origin is the bad one. That's the one that you really need to mitigate out of your environment if you have that now. And CORS is very widely misunderstood. I hope you pulled something from today's conversation that maybe you weren't thinking of before. But in case you're like, I don't know. This course thing's kind of good. Let me give you some final food for thoughts. Use Swagger, they said. It'll be better, they said, right? Look at Swagger's definition of CORS. CORS is a technique to prevent websites from doing bad things with your personal data. CORS is a technique to prevent websites from doing bad things with your personal data. So the weird thing about this is, other than the fact that CORS is actually some of the reason why we have these issues sometimes, this definition is not actually the definition for CORS. This definition is the definition for the same origin policy. CORS is a shim that lets you bypass the same origin policy, which basically, if not implemented right, can make you more akin to websites doing bad things with your data. So it's interesting. Even Swagger is basically giving you a definition of CORS, which is actually not really. Remember, CORS isn't a security control. It's the shim to bypass the security control, which is the same origin policy. So if you came into here or you're leaving here, you're like, man, this CORS thing is weird. Don't worry, it's confusing for everybody. It's not just you. So some references. I'll send you out the slide, and they were nice enough to record the conversation tonight, so we'll have access to that as well. But on Tim, his handle's Landmaster53, the source code for the demo that we did tonight is out there, so you can go and play around with it. Also, just if you're interested in some of the other research or some of the other talks that I've done, they're all listed there on kcody.co. And then Tim, his research is on landmaster53.com. He has a bunch of really good blogs. A lot of us we got to work with him, so we got to see a lot of his unique and interesting stuff. But he blogs a lot. He puts his stuff there. He does training and everything. And half of this research tonight, or half of the goods, were from him. So I want to give him props for that. So, any additional questions? Yeah. 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 So if you have a CDN and everything is running on HTTPS from the CDN. Yeah, I mean, usually a CDN, and I might be oversimplifying this here, but usually you're going to use a CDN for your static content that isn't changing a lot. So if you have your JavaScript or you have your CSS or whatnot on a CDN, so that's actually pushing that down to you. And then you're saying for then to reach out to a different origin, you would need CORS if you're going to do something like XHR, because it was actually given to you by the CDN's origin. Is that right? Yeah, that's a good point. I wish I could say that is why I found vulnerable. I can say that, although that's a very good point. I certainly don't dispute that. I've never seen a site that was like, oh yeah, we implemented CORS because of the CDN. But I just, I'm one person, so I don't get to see all the edge cases. But I think that's a really good point. Anyone else? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you've pointed out some really good points here. You can't respond back with a comment limited list. RFC won't allow it. Browsers won't do that. You don't want to do the wildcard because that opens you up to what I just showed you. Not the worst thing in the world, but not the best. Can you do a wildcard, but just for a portion of the site? The answer is no. So really, why do we have these problems? Because the RFC for CORS is actually really not very friendly. And the fact of the matter is, the browser is what enforces CORS, the same way the browser enforces the same origin policy. So the server has to basically feed the browser this very restricted set of headers that aren't very intuitive from a security control perspective. So you nailed it. Unfortunately, that would be like star.kcody.com or whatever. That would be a better way to do that. And maybe with the next CORS, there's some talk about the next RFC update to CORS. So hopefully we'll have that. You can do that, but you'd have to build that into your server side logic to verify the origin they're coming from. you could build a regex or something that said star dot whatever, and then echo that, only that, back to the user if it meets that condition. When you run into that, then you run into problems with regex, right? So if you can bypass the server-side regex, and we've seen that too. Yeah.
So let's say I have an API, and that API requires authentication. And so how do I configure? Then, like, I don't know who is going to call that API, because I may have like 4,000 different websites that I'm partnered with, that are integrated with. But I still want to have some. How would you configure that API?
From an Origin whitelist perspective,
Like, what would your configuration on that API?
so depending on your authentication mechanism and depending on what that API is set for, would be that would be what would be dependent on what controls that I would say.
Let's say it's just an API.
So if it's header authentication, the wildcard origin would actually be okay as long as the API that you're posting, or that the post or put or whatever that the endpoint is for the API isn't something that you're worried about being brute forced from an unauthenticated standpoint. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So unless it's literally a login that you're expecting the user has to be unauthenticated, you should be okay if you have header based credentials, because the wildcard origin only restricts the access control allow origin true, which is cookies. It doesn't include headers. So it's kind of it's a weird, kind of thing. But that is one thing that I'd say is our biggest saving grace right now, is that a lot of our microservices and federated auth systems are moving towards header based auth. And the just like cross-site request forgery, you can't cross-site request forge a request that is header auth. The same thing can be said for cores in that perspective. So yeah, if you're using header based auth, you don't have to worry about the like tailgating on cores thing for the session. And the reason for that is because JavaScript literally goes in, pulls those credentials out of your local or your session storage. To do that, it has to be JavaScript that has access to that origin. And to do that, it would be trusted JavaScript on the original site. So yeah, absolutely. Any other questions? All right, thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it.
Our next meetup will be January 23rd, assuming we don't set September. Everybody posted.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for coming out.
Hey, man.